It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's the most adaptable to change, that lives within the means available and works cooperatively against common threats. It's a quote from Charles Darwin. Today we're going to be looking at the biological beginnings of human development and specifically how it relates to, well, human development in general, and with a focus on brain development and how the kind of biological and the physical and the process of going from cells and how cells start to then duplicate and then split, and then how those things those split multiplied cells actually start to do different things, and we call that differentiation, just doing different things, and that those different things, and then they start to have different tasks and perform different roles, and if we keep going down that chain long enough, we eventually get to a fully functioning human brain. And that the steps in that process are fascinating, and that those fascinating steps in that process is our biological beginnings. So when we get into this topic of biological beginnings, we're really looking at some of these core questions that humans have dealt with throughout time, like, who we are and how do we make sense, and how does our existence on this planet fit in, and what came before us, and who are we, and what's coming after us. Why do we have change? Why do we grow old? Why do we like the things we like? What is death? Why are some people better at some things than others? How do all these things link to this dynamic interaction between our genetic makeup and our environment? That's what we're going to be talking about today. All right, let's get into this. I think it's interesting to address this early, this idea that humans are relatively young on this planet, and a lot of the complexity of evolution and organism development and all these processes predate humans by millions of years. The next thing I wanted to just say here is, like, we share elements of that DNA with the first eukaryotes, right? So these are kind of what you see there in that image of those gel-like looking organisms. We carry a history of all surviving DNA in our own. Now, I want you to think about that for a sec, like what that means. And I've kind of touched on this before in the last week's presentation, but just really thinking about this idea that our genetic inheritance isn't just our parents. It's thousands of generations, tens of thousands of generations. It's this long line of humanity that survived in our coding, in our genetic coding. You'll hear people say things like, we share about 50% of the same DNA as a banana. And that sounds kind of like a crazy thing to say, and what it's really getting at is this idea that genetic materials and proteins are made up of very specific things, and that's a building block of life. So there's incredible similarity in how different things that are alive, organic things in general, how they're constructed through this process of cell multiplication and division and reproduction and eventually specialization and the development of different organisms. So what a quote like that is really saying is we have similar building blocks at a cellular level. What makes us human specifically is the arrangement of that DNA, right, which we would call our genome. I think I'm going to say this a little bit later, but just because I thought of it now, a genome is an interesting word. You've heard of like the Human Genome Project. The word genome means, it's kind of like a combination of the word gene and chromosome. So that's where that comes from. Right, but this idea that despite sharing the same DNA as billions of other people, your DNA, your deoxyribonucleic acid is the full word, DNA, is completely individual. You're completely unique genetically, and that is so cool. That is so interesting. That individual uniqueness is so important to understanding human development, but that individual uniqueness is sprouting from a shared ancestry. Okay. Next slide. Sorry about that. So to start this, in the next few slides, we're going to get into this idea of what evolutionary psychology is and how it's kind of best to look at it as the flip side or the second kind of paired system of ideas with developmental psychology. So if in developmental psychology, a course like this, our primary focus is on how a human organism develops, right? So how a human being goes from a baby to a senior within one lifespan. And that's the big difference from developmental psych and evolutionary psych. Evolutionary psych, we're saying, okay, what about a series of lifespans, right? Which we'll just call like generations. We're going to look at this over long periods of time. Now, a guy like Darwin, so now we're very much on the nature side of this nature-nurture. And in this class, we're going to kind of bounce between these sides a lot as useful ways of seeing things. You've heard me say it already, but most of these complex things are a dynamic interaction between nature and nurture. But sometimes, at least theoretically, it's useful to take these as two theoretical starting points. And so Darwin's really interested in this idea, and he's also really interested in this idea in animals and specifically in birds because of how quickly their generations are. So for example, like human beings, say there's like me and then my parents and my parents' parents, and maybe in some scenarios like great-great-grandparents within like, let's say like 100-year period. But for birds, there'd be way more generations than just 4. So he was looking at these finches, just a type of bird in the Galapagos Islands. But Darwin was also very interested in child development, which is something about him that not a ton of people focus on. So let's look at a couple points here I want to make. So in Darwin's perspective, he would present this idea that humans come from evolution, that it's just not just at all, because he presented it as one of the most complex things that's ever happened on Earth, right? That the development of the human mind is this complex result from this long construction development process, evolutionary process, that was heavily shaped in different ways, and that we share aspects of that with things that came before us. For example, like all mammals have a nervous system, even mammals that existed way before humans did. That's what I mean with shared stuff from a biological evolutionary kind of development perspective. According to someone like Darwin, he would be looking at this idea that evolution, or how things affect us and how that affecting gets transmitted long-term through changes to the population over time, that's actually how we perceive it affects how we perceive the world, it affects how we talk, how we interact, how we behave, how we experience relationships, how we make sense of things, what we're attracted to, what we're repulsed by, what we find appetizing, what we find gross. That you can't view it in isolation. Those things have roots. A central piece of this is this idea that those who reproduce pass on these characteristics to the next generation, so that nature's inherently biased towards what he would call survival of the fittest. And this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with physical strength, because ability to survive in a situation might come down to something like how long, let's just use an animal for example, how long an animal can go without water. And if an animal can go longer than another animal without water in a drought scenario over extended periods of time, that one animal might be more likely to survive, more likely to have kids of their own, more likely to pass on that genetic material, continue that line, and that's happening all over the place everywhere. And so what fitness is doesn't necessarily, although it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with physical strength or speed, although oftentimes it does. It can have to do with, ability to work together. It can have to do with the ability to hide. All these different things. It can be the ability to immediately form relationship with mom, especially if we're talking about the survival of things like birds, right? So that there's certain characteristics that get prioritized for survival-related reasons. And that's happening constantly. And that's basically what evolution is. That organisms are engaging in environmental pressure and responding. I hope that kind of makes sense. He thought that then future generations will result from their own evolution, and that it would be almost silly to think that everything happened up until now, and then we're in this like final state where everything's just how it's going to be. It would make more sense to view it as a continual chain that we're at a certain point in. Right, again, when we're talking about the different theorists, I'm gonna try to sort of speak from their perspective. So I'm trying to just talk as if I, am representing some of those ideas. And with that, I want to read this. So Darwin reasoned that an intense, constant struggle, you don't have to worry about writing this in your notes, but this is just additional. Darwin reasoned that an intense, constant struggle for food, water, and resources must occur because among the young of each generation, because many of them don't survive. Those that do then reproduce. Now, remember, maybe you can view this in any context, but in this scenario, let's just say we're talking about these birds, right? The Darwin finches, that the young of them that are able to struggle to get the food, the water, the resources, the shelter, that are able to do those things to an age in which they're able to then have kids their own, are actually able to pass on their characteristics to the next generation. Over the course of many generations, organisms with the characteristics needed for survival make up an increased percentage of the population. This is what the term survival of the fittest means. It refers to the ability to bear offsprings that will survive long enough to bear offsprings of their own, thus favoring the behaviors that increase reproductive success. That is the ability to pass genes to the next generation. And it's interesting if you look at birds, like on Netflix, actually, I don't know if it's still on there, but there was for a while a show that was kind of like a kid's show because it was just funny, but it was really birds doing what you could behaviorally call mating behavior, but to us it just looks like they're dancing. That's a very interesting thing from a behavioral perspective, what that performative aspect of behavior is and how that gets encoded into a species after it being prioritized by the environment over periods of time. I hope that's making sense. All right, I'll wrap up this slide. Next slide. So here's a good definition here for your notes of natural selection. Natural selection is the evolutionary process. So again, this idea of over generations or over sequences of lifetimes, the evolutionary process by which individuals of a species that are best adapted to their environment, survival of the fittest, are the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. And Darwin thought this was super important, and that this wasn't just one thing to add to the list, but that this demanded a whole new look at a lot of things. And one thing some people don't realize about Darwin is this tore him up inside. He knew what this would mean to religious people. He knew what it meant to challenge the entire narrative. Yeah, I don't know if people sometimes understand how that scenario was to him and how he kind of gets remembered as against religion, and in some ways was, but he's a very complex, interesting, super smart person that very multidimensional. And he thought that this whole idea of natural selection was actually so important because it had incredible insights to teach us about emotion, perception, cognition, and how those things evolved and how understanding how they evolved can inform our understanding of how they currently function. And just think of those things, right? Like, those aren't three small things. Your emotions, your perceptual engagement with reality, your perceptions, right? So not your sensations, but how you're interpreting your sensations. And your entire cognitive realm, your decision making, your memory, your ability to weigh risk, that all those things are results of evolutionary pressures, and that our ancestors that were able to succeed through that long line of pressures were the ones most likely to survive and reproduce. So things get a little interesting here. So now when we're looking at this idea of evolutionary psychology theory, and you think about that, what it's saying is there's these genetic influences, which seems like it would be on the nature side of the nature-nurture, and this is maybe one of the best examples that kind of shows how that distinction is just theoretical. But actually, it's sort of also an argument for the nurture, because what it's saying is that the pressures experienced in the individual lifespans within that evolutionary sequence matter and have effect and shape things and have effects that ripple through, butterfly effect through generations. One of the newest approaches to psychology, this idea of evolutionary psychology, emphasizes the importance of things like adaptation. So adaptation, like resiliency, the ability to change, and oftentimes change under incredible pressures and incredible threat. Reproductive pressures, so the pressures around having successful offspring, which for most of the organic world is a constant pressure and threat to continue, right? Like raising successful offspring, whether we're talking about humans or whether we're talking about wolves or whether we're talking about, well, you get my point. It's a highly complex central aspect of evolution, and then this idea of survival of the fittest exerting pressure on that. So in evolutionary psychology, we're looking a lot on these things and how that these things actually have huge influence on, as we were saying before, like how we perceive the world, how we speak, how we behave. Our group behavior evolves models of cultural group selection, meaning that like this is happening and affecting how we're interacting and not just making sense of our own experience, but also at a group level. And that certain cultures have selection. When it says selection, it means selection pressures, meaning like what that means is, say in a certain society, people are only attracted to tall people, there'd be a selection pressure towards being tall, and that different cultures will have different selection pressures, which is really a very nurture philosophical argument. It's a very situational argument. And it gets to this kind of underlying notion that at a certain point, what we're talking about here with evolutionary psychology theory is sort of a marriage between those two ideas of nature and nurture. That our nature is affected by our environment, and that has ripple effects, and that that's not unique to us, and that we're not the first one in that chain. So the title of this slide is a little bit of a tongue twister, but I think this idea of, obviously the course we're in now is developmental psychology, and a proposition is this idea that's like so core to understanding the philosophical orientation that if you know these kind of three things, it can be almost interpretive lenses for looking at a whole range of issues. And one of the ones that is core to this evolutionary look at developmental psychology is that there's this direct relationship between the length of childhood in humans and this dramatic amount of brain development. So if you see this figure that I have here on the left, you see the brain development in brain size along the upper axis, and then across the bottom axis you see how long the juvenile period is, and that it seems like, at least to a certain extent, that the primates that are in longer childhoods, it's basically saying the longer the childhood, the more the brain development, and that one of the reasons that humans are born so vulnerable and with such a need for protection, especially compared to other species, right? You compare that to, like, say, a deer that is born immediately able to, as soon as it can stand, it could run away from a wolf. Now, the price it pays for that is it's born almost entirely developed cognitively, meaning that, well, quite literally just meaning that a deer is it's not a super smart animal. It's a relatively dumb animal, for lack of a more scientific way of saying it. It would have a reduced brain size, right? And this idea that time of childhood in human beings, as far as we know of, the only thing that's close is really maybe dolphins, elephants, some of the primates, but that this extended childhood allows for longer brain development and actually literally affects brain size, which is pretty interesting. That this allows us to gain valuable life experiences, right? Like, we haven't even got to things like school and stuff like that yet, but that the complexities of society and this longer childhood period for brain development that allows for things like school and specialization and all that stuff, and that you can't view that as separate from complex adult society. An extended childhood period might have evolved because humans require time to develop a larger brain, have vital experiences, and learn the complexities of human society. Humans take longer to become reproductively mature, sexually mature, than any other primate. The second of these big propositions in evolutionary developmental psychology's framework is the idea that humans evolved domain-specific psychological mechanisms for specific needs. So think about what a psychological mechanism is first. That's like a way of, I think of what a mechanism is. That's like a machine. It's a machine that does a certain thing for a certain reason in a certain situation. So a psychological mechanism is a thing your brain does in certain situations for certain effects, and that those psychological mechanisms evolved domain specific, meaning certain things doing certain other things, like processing stress a certain way or processing visual information a certain way, or these different pressures made these domain specific, meaning like domain specific means that some things do some things and some things do other things. It's the opposite of saying that every part of your brain does the exact same thing, right? If one part's doing something, another part's doing something, another part's doing something else. One part's, I'll be more specific, one part's handling vision, one part's your memory center, one part's an emotional center. Those tasks are domain specific, is the way you could say it. And that we had specific needs is just another way of saying pressures on us as humans, our ancestors. Again, I'm talking evolution takes effect over long periods of time. And that these pressures led to the development of certain psychological mechanisms to meet certain demands, and that one mind doesn't fit all is a way of saying this idea of like there's this underlying physical structure of the brain, and then it gets into this classic discussion of what's the difference between brain and mind, right? And you can kind of look at it, and I would love to talk about this or maybe do an assignment on it. Maybe that's a decent idea for something we can work on later or something, but because at a certain part we're talking about kind of the operating system and the software, right? Like what's the actual physical thing that we call the brain? How does that brain process? What do we even mean when we use this word mind? How is that different than a word like conscience or conscious, I meant to say? And that this idea that the mind evolved in specialized models, meaning like, so if we're saying, and again, we're just using this language to try to talk about what's going on between our ears, but this idea, if we're talking about the brain as kind of the hardware and the mind almost is, and forgive the metaphor for kind of being overly simplistic, but the mind is the software, the brain is the hardware, the mind is the software, and that the implementation of that software is often dependent on historical and cultural situational pressure. And again, we could talk for days on the difference between brain and mind. That's one of the most interesting questions there is, right? Like how much of what we even experience as what we would think is our mind, how much of that is like, we could get into the argument, or not the argument, but the discussions of things like free will and how much of it is us and how much of it is, situational byproduct. I think that's a fascinating discussion, and it's multi-layered and, still hotly debated. Okay, next slide. This third one is one that we're all going to understand, and I think it's one of the best examples of how sometimes the system takes a long time to catch up, right? And you can make this argument that like we're nowhere near evolved to being exposed to social media and having to care what people that we may never meet think of us and their pressures on us. It's like our ancestors never would have cared at all, and that wasn't part of their psychological world. And we haven't evolved yet to a point where the pressure of that has shaped our evolution. Now, we probably eventually will, if it continues in a somewhat stable way. But this idea here, and you see all like these sweet candies on the screen, and it's this notion that like high calorie food had incredible value to our ancestors, and things like this almost trick our biology because it's hitting a reward system that evolved in a different space. And sometimes these evolved mechanisms do not always adapt quickly or well. Meaning like we don't always evolve to a better thing. There's no implication in any of this that it's always a positive course correction. Okay, sorry, I got a little aggressive on that point. I'm trying to not be boring. I'm trying to just be a little engaged, right? So sorry if I'm sounding a little intense here, but I think this is an interesting idea, right? So it's like, it's obviously linked to this idea that then we're almost like genetically set up to not be able to handle these kind of things. And I think one of the tricks to learning how to handle these things is understanding what's happening and understanding that it's not necessarily us. It's not my daughter who's 4 years old. It's not her fault that she would rather have Cinnamon Toast Crunch than shredded wheat. It's like everything about her experience of Cinnamon Toast Crunch is rewarding her to do that again. It's like the effect of something like sugar is very interesting, really, and how you can understand how we're kind of uniquely vulnerable to it. Just like I was making the connection to social media and how we're uniquely vulnerable to other people's pressure on our identity, for example, in the terms of like how we make sense of ourselves in the world from social pressures that even a few generations ago like literally didn't exist. Right? Like you only have to go back into like the 90s and the 80s before like social media wasn't a part of things. Like I was in high school in the 90s and there was like computers in the library, you could look stuff up, but like I think I might have had a flip phone. There was no Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and those things that I just named are probably now dated. Right? And it's like that pressure wasn't the same. And yeah, like it doesn't always go quickly or well. Old reward systems may become maladaptive in a modern context. So think of if adaptive means you're under pressure. So if someone's like, oh, you're really able to adapt under pressure, what do they mean? They mean that when you're in a situation where you're stressed, you can respond in maybe a new way that actually helps. That's a kind of generalized way of saying it, but you could say like things that help the situation in general are adaptive, like things that maladaptive then, so maladaptive meaning like not adaptive. So sometimes we can develop or evolve or move in certain ways or a certain system in this case of doing things or rewarding things, like how our brain gives us this like dopamine reward hit when the sugar hits our system, because having high amounts of calories was a prized goal of our ancestors. Like that's so complex. These are, if you really break it down into what it's actually saying and what it's actually applying, and this is existing as a situational pressure over time that's getting encoded, and that it's affecting how we're interpreting things now. Yeah, so anyways, you can probably tell that I find this topic quite interesting. Okay, next slide. So in terms of criticism, because it's not like evolutionary psychology or evolutionary developmental psychological theorists came along and said, well, we think it's this, this, and this, and everyone was like, oh, thanks for informing us of the new right answer. We now throw away all of our ideas. It's like, obviously there's a lot of critique and pushback, and some of the criticisms are worth pointing out and interesting. One of them is by someone that we've already mentioned in this course, and it's Albert Bandura, and his idea we talked about earlier and we'll come back to around this, he called it reciprocal determinism, and that we influence our environment and our environment influences us, and it's what's called bidirectional. So it's not just our world influences us, and it's also not just we influence the world. That arrow has to go both ways. It's bidirectional. One criticism comes from the cognitive theorist Albert Bandura. He acknowledges the important influence of evolution on human adaptation. However, so again, like this is, he's saying like, I agree with this, but it's kind of more this. He's trying to clarify here. And again, I'm not necessarily siding with either, but so that you know that there's debate on this. He acknowledges the important influence of evolution on human adaptation. However, he rejects what he calls a one-sided view or one-sided evolutionism, which sees social behavior as a product of evolved biological characteristics. Like, we've encoded this genes and how we act now is just because of that. Bandura suggests, as an alternative view, this idea of a bidirectional view in which environmental and biological conditions influence each other, that idea of the two-directional arrow. This is his idea that he published in 1998. In this view, evolutionary pressures created changes in biological structures that allowed the use of tools, which enabled our ancestors to manipulate the environment, constructing new environmental conditions. In turn, environmental innovations produced new selection pressures that led to the evolution of specialized biological systems for consciousness, thought, and language. It's a pretty interesting idea. I got to give Bandura that. I'm a pretty big fan of evolutionary psychology in general. I think it's highly interesting. But I think he's almost suggesting in addition to this that we can look at this, but we also can't assume that it's like we've been influenced in this way and now we're in the environment and our influence is everything that shapes how we are now, because that's too much of just the nature side of nature nurture. There's also environmental influences on us right now, and they're significant, right? And another way of saying that is, you obviously know that it's not like the relationships in your life and the place you work and where you're going to school and your family. It's not like those things don't influence you, of course, or then the time you live in and all those kind of situational factors play a role. And Bandura is saying like we need to keep this focus on this bidirectional thing, that evolution maybe gives these interesting explanations for how certain body structures, like even things like the brain, develop, and how certain biological potential for things develop. But the critique is at the level of, okay, so great, so this developed because of this and in this way. But where the criticism is coming is at the level of using that information to explain why we do certain behaviors. People are like this because of this, and this links to these roots, right? So it's where the critique is coming at the level of how it influences behavior. I hope I'm making that clear. I know I was a little rambly there. But a really important thing to keep in mind, and that's why, it's a little hard on the eyes, but I have it in like red, highlighted yellow. Time frames that are required for human evolution make testing this like almost entirely impossible for certain things, right? Like there's no way to do a long-term study on the effect of social media over the next 400 years. I guess you could if you had like a team of, because you'd probably need a timeline at least that long. You'd probably need it'd be interesting to actually look at how many generations you would need to have and how many actual years that would equal to show a significant impact on how social media has actually affected the functioning of our brains. Let's just focus on one thing, our reward systems, or maybe our emotional systems, or maybe on our memory. How is the effect of so much of our experiences being remembered in almost digital picture and video form, and does that affect how? So all these things are super interesting, but don't lend well to like going in a lab and testing. So at this point, without further ado, it's time to jump into establishing some idea of what this genetic development looks like. And I should have just read the title there, the foundations of that development, right? Like what we're going to be focusing on here are these core building blocks of development. And the first thing is this that I want you to have in your notes is the term genes. And you've definitely heard that word before. That they're these short segments, these short pieces of DNA. I have there the heredity information, right? The information passed on to us through the process of reproduction with the parents. And we're going to get into all that in a sec. And that these short segments of DNA that collaboratively direct cells to reproduce and manufacture protein, and that's basically the building blocks of life. And this idea that our DNA is not just inherited from our parents. It's also what we inherited as a species from the species that came before us. It's interesting to think that, I'll just put these all up for a second. It's interesting to think that each of us begin as a single cell weighing, check out this, 1/trillionth of a kilogram. This tiny piece of matter houses our entire genetic code, the instruction manual that orchestrates growth from the single cell to a person made of trillions of cells, each containing a replica of the original code, that code carried by our genes. These genetic traits get encoded in the genes, And just think what that word retained means. It means it's not that's not lost. It's transmitted generation after generation. DNA is inherited from all species that came before us. It's better almost understood as a genetic code of humanity, or what they call it, like the human genome, which again, just in case you missed it earlier, genome is just a word combining gene and chromosome. That human genetic code is actually what we are at a certain level, at a genetic biological level, and that's actually what literally prevents human fertilized eggs from becoming anything other than a human. It's almost like a specific, I'm trying to not just say software code, but it's hard not to say it like that. It's almost like the programming code sequence is different than other things, and there's a human one, and that is actually what literally that's written into our DNA. It's pretty fascinating, really. So, and this is all like in, obviously the DNA is like, it's so interesting to think that it's relatively recent that humans understood this. So on that last slide, I just reviewed it, and I noticed I forgot to comment on the last point, and I want to say something about that, because what it was saying is that even though that there's a 99% similarity, that what makes us unique is found in that other 1%. And it's such an interesting point to think about these days, is like just how much everything's the same, and how our uniqueness exists in this small part that makes us so individually kind of, specially unique. I don't know, that point just seemed to really hit me for some reason. I think it's very interesting that what makes us different is contained within that 1%, and that just we're so similar, especially like if you're comparing only people alive today, like in this time period. And I touched on some of this idea of how much it weighs, and that it's almost interesting to view our genetic code as an instruction manual of how to create cells, and eventually some of those cells specialize, and eventually we're talking about actual brain cells. And that this replication, this whole process of replicating and specializing, is kind of going to be what we're going to be talking about coming up here. And that, please have this in your notes too, that the nucleus of each human cell contains 46 chromosomes specifically. The nucleus of each human cell. Okay, so within every human cell there's a nucleus, and within that nucleus is where the chromosome is. So if you look at the image there, the chromosome are these thread-like structures, and that what actually is making those up, if you were to like break down what's in those threads, are actually the double helixes of the DNA. They're made up of that deoxyribonucleic acid, that DNA. DNA is this complex molecule that has a double helix shape, like a spiral staircase, and a helix means like, well, a helix is like the shape of a staircase. I should have just went with what I already said. But yeah, it's like that wiggle, just what you're thinking of the shape when you picture what DNA looks like. That spiral staircase, and that's what contains the genetic information. That genes are the unit, these smaller units of hereditary information, kind of like a segment of DNA. So here's an image of what I was just talking about, and in case you didn't have that, I didn't have that on the last screen, so you might want to just add those two definitions that are in yellow. I think it's just, you'll always hear that idea that the DNA is a double helix. So that's helix is just literally like a shape, or a shape like a corkscrew shape. And then the idea of a gene being like a segment of DNA. And I like how that picture kind of shows, like if you were to go into those threads that we showed on the last slide as the chromosome, and you were to magnify it, which is what's happening there with that magnifying glass image, the DNA would actually look like this staircase double helix. That's so cool. So these genes are short segments of DNA. I've said this a few times, but I think it's really important to kind of get our heads on in this frame of talking about it, that when we're talking about DNA and when we're talking about parts of DNA, that's what we mean when we say genes. Because it's kind of confusing, because the word genetic is obviously almost the same as the word genes, and genes means something kind of specific within that. So I think just the clarification and a bit of repetition around that might be a little bit helpful. I wanted to make this point too, that sorry, that was like I set myself up totally, and then I just kind of froze for a sec because I was looking for the quote. That one scientist thought that, because I wanted to talk about this idea that how there's 20,700, because it's really interesting that we used to think there was way more than that. We used to think that there was like 100,000 genes. So here I found the thing I was stumbling for there. One scientist thought that humans had approximately 100,000 genes. One of the big surprises reported by the Human Genome Project, remember genome, just gene and chromosome, project, was that humans have only about 30,000 genes. More recently, the number of human genes has been revised further down to approximately 20,700. Now that's from some research by a guy named Fleck, or a researcher named Fleck, in 2013. The activity of genes, which we call genetic expression, is affected by the environment. For example, hormones that circulate in the blood make their way into the cell, where they can turn genes on and off. The flow of hormones can be affected by environmental conditions, such as light, day length, nutrition, behavior. I think you might find this interesting here. One study revealed that an increase in concentration of the stress hormone cortisol produced a 5-fold increase in DNA damage. I'm going to read that again, because that's what that's saying is hugely significant, because how many of us have so much stress? And what is stress biochemically? It's when we have cortisol increases and concentrations in our blood. One study revealed that an increase in that concentration of stress hormones, especially cortisol, or it says such as cortisol, not especially, sorry, produced a 5-fold increase in DNA damage. Another study found that exposure to radiation changed the rate of DNA synthesis in cells. Another study indicated that sleep deprivation can affect gene expression in such negative ways as increased inflammation, expression of stress-related genes, and an impairment in the ability for proteins to function. And remember, proteins are like the building blocks of all these cells. All human cells, except the sperm and egg cells, have 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. So if you're watching at home, it's probably a good time for a coffee break or something. We're hitting around, getting in close to an hour, but I want to really make this point here that as we go forward, I want to stress that genes aren't just collaborative, meaning one thing we're going to look at is how they interact and work together, but also that they're enduring. And this is one thing that's so interesting, and it's so easy from an evolutionary framework to look at how things got to here. But I want to push this idea that it's almost equally interesting to look at the goal of everything might not be just to get to here, and where is it going, right? Which is sort of related to my concern around certain things like social media's effect on people's ability to have, I don't know, mental health in the broadest sense. I think you could make a really interesting study on how those two things influence each other at all kinds of levels. And the one thing that you could say a lot of things, but one thing you definitely can't say is that we fully understand the evolutionary and developmental impact of it. How do things get passed from generation to generation, and how does that actually literally affect trillions of cells literally in our body? That to understand this, we really have to talk about three things. All right, and these are three biological processes: mitosis, meiosis, and fertilization. And so I'm going to do a little piece on each of these. So an absolutely core piece to understand when we're talking about things like genetics and what actually is happening is this idea of mitosis and how cells are literally changing from a small amount of cells to a large amount of cells, how they're actually reproducing. Because that's sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, the magic of life, that the cell nucleus can duplicate itself and then divide. It can be one thing and turn into two things and then split and be two things. And that's really the starting point of all this conversation, that the cell nucleus, including chromosomes, duplicate and divide, that two cells are formed and that each contains the same DNA as that original cell, arranged in the same 23 pairs, right? 46 chromosomes, so 23 pairs, so 23 times 2, 46. I know you probably already knew that, but. So the other word used in this context is meiosis, and that refers to the egg and the sperm cells, which are collectively called the gametes. So while I'm explaining this, it might be interesting for you to look at the visual depiction of this on the right, that whether we're talking about the testes or the ovaries, that what happens is that there's a duplication of the cell. So you see the one red becoming the two and the one blue becoming the two. It then divides twice. So the cell or the testes of the ovary duplicate the chromosomes, but then divide twice, thus forming the four. And then each has only half of the genetic information of the parent cell. So at this point, so we're one step before fertilization. So you see here how it breaks down. I'll just read that again because I kind of said that a little bit disjointed. A cell of the testes or ovaries duplicates its chromosome, but then divides twice. So that's the third and fourth layer of that image, thus forming four cells, each of which has only half the genetic information of the parent cell. By the end of the meiosis process, each of the four cells has 23 unpaired chromosomes. Okay, so that's half the genetic material of the parent cell. So, spoiler alert, they're about to join together, and that's what we're going to call fertilization. So the last part of this process is what is referred to as fertilization. So in fertilization, this is when the egg and sperm cell fuse to create this single cell called a zygote. Okay, so this is what you're seeing here on the right. The egg sperm, each contribute 23 unpaired chromosomes. So those 23 unpaired chromosomes we were just talking about, and then those combined to make these 23 pairs then, right? So 23 unpairs on both sides combined together for 23 that are now paired. So I hope that unpaired versus paired makes sense, right? They've separated, now they're combining. This recombination is what we're calling fertilization. Now, one place where this gets interesting, and I'd like you to have this for sure in your notes, is that chromosomes aren't exact copies. And there's reasons for that. And the simplest way of saying it is that there's copying errors that happen, and you can call those genetic mutations, or you can call those, replication errors is what I think the correct term is basically like, again, a computer metaphor would make sense. It's like you copied the URL for the website wrong. One of the letters was wrong. It's like, it's obviously not exactly like that, but it might be a useful metaphor for thinking about what a genetic code copying error would mean. That chromosomes aren't exact copies of parental DNA. They actually increase, which is why there's this increased variability in the amount of characteristics that can be a result of it. It's why even identical twins aren't the exact same, and we're going to talk about twins today, but it's why parents could have 4 boys and the boys could all be very different, even though their genetic makeup is very similar. That this variability is actually a core thing, and it gives different, it's like, so say those 4 boys are very different, well, the pressures of that environment will interact with them differently, which is what that means where it says it increases the genetic variability in the amount of characteristics on which natural selection can operate. This variability creates several important sources of variation. For example, first, the chromosome and the zygotes are not exact copies, like I was saying. The formation of the sperm and egg in meiosis, during that time, members of each pair are separated, but which chromosome goes with which pair at the gamete level is somewhat of a matter of chance. There's this element in genetics that's hard to kind of, I'm adding this, but there's this element in genetics that's hard to account for, which is randomness. There's a randomness component to all of this, just to complicate everything a little bit more. In addition, I hope you're finding this kind of interesting. I'm going to just keep going here. In addition, before the pairs separate, pieces of the 2 chromosomes in each pair are exchanged, creating a new combination of genes on the chromosome. Another source of variability comes from DNA. When chance events, a mistake in the cellular machinery, so before I called that like a copying error, or damage caused by an environmental agent such as radiation, which is why, for example, if you're a male and you go to get an X-ray, you have to hold a lead shield, like a kind of shield thing or whatever, over your genitals only, because those specific, the DNA in the testes is susceptible to radiation at a level that is much more sensitive. That was a weird example, but that's totally true though. Chance events, so that's like I said that chance events, a mistake by the cellular machinery, a copying error, or damage caused by an environmental agent like radiation can produce a mutated gene. So this is where this aspect of genetics that's important to kind of consider is the role of things like randomness and the role of things like mutation, copying error. And that can have a permanent impact on DNA. So I've already today made a couple computer-related references, but I think actually with this specific topic of genetics, it makes sense. And you can almost look at, I think this is a really important distinction to help us understand genetics, is the difference between what's called a genotype and a phenotype. So what a genotype is it's like if you viewed genetics as a code, that's what the actual code says. It's like pretend you're making a website and you're writing the code for the site and you're putting the code, and then that code makes the text on the actual site a certain color, but it's what you typed in as the code. That's the genotype. The phenotype is that text being that color. So what I'm meaning here is like the genotype is the information that's literally in your genetics. The phenotype is what it does, like your hair color, your height. It's the expression of it, the phenotype. The genotype includes your entire, or the totality of your individual genetic makeup. including what are called susceptibility genes and longevity genes. And I'll get to that in just one sec. But then the phenotype is kind of like how that's expressed. So if you were to say like, what's the difference between somebody that has blonde hair and brown hair? Well, the phenotype in that scenario is the blonde hair or the brown hair. The genotype is whatever that literal code difference is that makes one blonde and one brown. So the genotype is the code, the phenotype is the expression of that code. How it actually would appear as an observable characteristic: height, weight, hair color, and even psychological things like, now this is way more complicated when we're talking about like how genetics influence personality and how they influence something especially as complex as personality and intelligence, two of the most complicated topics there are, period, especially when we're talking about how they're linked to genetics. And it's not obviously an easy link, but the idea would be like if we could establish that certain genes are linked to intelligence, for example, that the genes, we would assume then, depending on someone's intelligence level, the genes would be different. That coding is the genotype. The level of intelligence is a phenotype. So I know that's a little more clumsy of a way, but that's a little bit more complicated to talk about how it's also relevant for psychological characteristics. It's a lot easier to explain it talking about something like hair color is probably the best, easiest example. It's the most demonstratable. It's like literally this idea of the coding for blonde hair and then actually having blonde hair. And the other examples are the same thing, just again, more higher level of complexity. Here is I'm going to go over some of the language that is used around genetics and not try to simplify it, but just try to operationalize it so we can use it as kind of functional language to talk about this stuff. So like, for example, a series of things you'll hear is this idea of how dominance and recessiveness affects gene expression. So a really clear example of that is something like eye color, like you can see on the screen here, that if two parents have brown eyes, the chances of having a child with brown eyes are almost guaranteed. If both parents have blue eyes, they're probably going to have a blue-eyed child. Now again, that's not always guaranteed, and the reason that's not always guaranteed is because your genetic inheritance isn't just from your immediate parents. So again, it's not always as easy as that direct of a route. But the idea here is that if one parent has brown eyes and one parent has blue eyes, the likelihood of the child having brown eyes is almost guaranteed. Because in that scenario, where it's almost like there's a competition, both exist, it could go either way, there seems to be a consistent pattern towards going a certain way. And we would say that that consistent pattern is a dominance pattern. And a pattern of consistently losing in that scenario is what we would call a recessive pattern. So that our gene characteristic, one gene characteristic in a chromosome pair dominates passing the code. So a gene characteristic would be like the eye color code. One dominates the other. Most mutation genes happen at a recessive level. So for example, the eye color of blue is a mutation. And so yeah, it's a mutate. But viewing it as a mutation that's like a weird, people think that I'm talking about like X-Men or something. It's like a mutation just means a change, right? So we have to be a little careful with how we use the language. I know that I knew you weren't thinking that, but just it's interesting when like in psychology there's a very specific use of a word, but that word is also used in general culture all the time. And so sometimes it's just useful to clarify specifically. Okay, next slide. So then I think this is interesting too, that the sex difference between male and female exists on the 23rd chromosome specifically. All right, and this is this idea that women have two X genes in their pair. If one X gene mutates, there's still a backup copy, whereas males have one Y and one X gene. And that this differentiation happens on the 23rd chromosome. A very interesting, at least I find super interesting point, is this idea of how what's called polygenetic inheritance. So that sounds super complicated, but all it means is when, say before I was giving the example of intelligence, and I forget what the other one was, intelligence and personality, where I was saying like it's not like one specific gene is that, it's like it's actually a very complex polygenetic type of inheritance. So that's what that word polygenetic means. It means there's multiple genes at work. So the image there kind of shows that in the 20th century, people started to become really, as we started to understand genetics much more, and we started to move beyond, like some of the earliest experimentation with genetics was with plants and stuff like that, and looking at how one thing influences one thing, and we started to realize that actually genetics does affect complex organisms, but at a very complex way. And a way to talk about this is what's called polygenetic inheritance, which just means that there's multiple genes affecting something complicated like intelligence. Your intelligence is something that has roots, but that is those roots are complex. They're polygenetic. Again, sorry if I said that word a ton of times there, but I'm just kind of trying to hammer home the meaning of it. That inherited characteristics are mostly determined by this interaction between many inherited genes from our ancestors. And then what we call that is polygenetic, that our genome isn't static. That's a way of saying it too, that the genome, and again, genome, this way of talking about the genes and the chromosomes, that our genome system are what makes us genetically human. From an evolutionary perspective, it's not static. It's another way of saying it's not static is it's open to evolution, or influenced by evolutionary pressures is a better way of saying it. So if you look at the picture of these two guys on the screen here, right, the first thing you notice when you look at these two guys is, if I was to say, like, tell me something quick about them, what would you tell me? It's like, well, first of all, they're brothers that look the exact the same, right? Like you would just assume they were brothers. And the reason I'm saying that is because there's something very interesting about identical twins from a research perspective, because it's as close as you can get genetically. And so if you have two people that are as close as you can get genetically, and then if you see how they live differently, it's one of the most interesting ways of looking at how the environment shapes people. Now, an absolute kind of gold mine as a researcher, like, let alone it's not ethical because in some ways, because, well, you could never design the study to do this. You'd have to do a natural experiment, which I'm about to talk about in a sec. But this idea of like having two twins that were somehow separated at birth and lived completely different lives and then reconnected way later. And that would be, from a research perspective, very different to see how much their similar genetics shaped the development of their life. Like, were some of their behaviors actually influenced by their genetic similarity? This is what we're calling behavior genetics. Like, is it more than just intelligence and eye color and that stuff? Is there actually like a behavioral level component to our genetic inheritance? It's actually a super fascinating question. And these field studies are looking, that I'm about to get to in a sec, looking at the influence of heredity, so what we inherit, and our environment, and how that links to how we develop certain traits, and which basically just means like why we do what we do. Second part here, that environmental, so just looking at how this is really an interesting kind of view into how environment shapes, and really from a nurture perspective, you couldn't have a more interesting what's called natural experiment, or they're saying here field study. So basically what I mean when I keep saying natural experiment is like, say that there were two twins that were separated at birth already, and then they like reconnected when they were older, and then you like thought that was interesting and met with them and asked them questions about it. It's like there's nothing really unethical about that, but you obviously can't take two babies and separate them just for your study. It's like that's obviously like an ethical, well, that's obviously child abuse, or I don't know, like you couldn't do that just for a research study, obviously, right? But so that's what a natural experiment is. Sometimes things that you would never do in a research study, a situation naturally happens, and we're going to get to that in just a sec. So tune in to the next slide. Minnesota. At the University of Minnesota, they conducted, this is interesting, it's called like Born Together, Reared Apart, these Minnesota twin studies. Let me read this real quick. In 1979, researchers led by Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota invited to Minnesota genetically identical twins from all over the world who had been separated at birth to discover their similarities and differences in characteristics of personality, intelligence, behavior. And to do that, the participating twins completed personality and intelligence tests. They provided detailed medical histories. They were asked questions about their family, their childhood, their personal interests, their academic abilities, their family life, their vocational or work orientation, their values, their aesthetic judgments. So even like, their taste in things like fashion. A striking example is the Jim twins, Jim Springer and Jim Lewis, who were separated at 4 years of age and didn't see each other again until they were 39. Not only did both of their adoptive parents name them both Jim, they both had dogs that they named Toy. They both married and divorced a woman named Betty, a different Betty. Amazingly, too, one Jim named his son James Allen. The other named his son James Allen, the same name, but just with one of the Allens has two L's, the other one only has one. While one can debate the role of coincidence in a story like this, it's hard to argue that genes would have played zero factor in that. So I like how it says that, right? It's like, you can definitely say that some of that's probably coincidence. But it's certainly interesting, isn't it? And I think I think it's hinting at something super complex. The genes, it says this is kind of a poetic way of trying to say it, that genes sing a prehistoric song that today should sometimes be resisted. Let me say this again. The genes sing a prehistoric song that today should sometimes be resisted, but with which it would be foolish to ignore. So I think this one's kind of interesting, and like father, like son, why have that in the background? And I know it's like I'm a father. I don't have a son though. I have a daughter, and I think the saying applies in the same way. What's interesting though is this is like such an old saying, right? And why I wanted to highlight it is it's interesting how sometimes an understanding of things like what we would now call genetic inheritance can even be like found in poems, and it's not like people were completely ignorant of this stuff just before we knew what passive genotype environment correlation means, which is a super fancy way of saying that like how your genotype, so that coded information, how that relates to your environment, right? And how is it like an active engagement or is it kind of passive? So passive genotype environmental correlation is kind of like that idea of like father, like son, that the son's growing up in an environment around the father. And so because the father's a certain way, the son's more likely to also be that way. Because my dad liked hockey, I'm more likely to like hockey because the chance to like hockey is more likely to be present. That biological parents sometimes provide, again, like it's not like they know they're doing it. This is what Scar's talking about in the theory here around like the relationship between heredity, environment, nature, nurture. The biological parents provide an environment which can transfer their interests and inclinations to the child. Right? So this is, an example of like a nurture level effect. But that some of that, this is why it's so complex. And this is why it's defying this simplistic nature-nurture distinction, because the nurture environment that the father in this metaphor is creating is influenced, who that father is in that moment is influenced by who they are genetically. So it's like this, it's like a chicken and the egg thing at a certain level. So it's nature and nurture. I hope that that's being clear. Kind of what I'm trying to do with this is play with that idea a little bit of nature and nurture, and kind of hint at how that's been a kind of core point of contention in psychology, like, and even today, like how much of things is genetic and how much of things is all just learned or social construction or whatever kind of the modern way of saying it is, like this idea that like we are our environment rather than we are our biology. And that this tension, and again, I've said this a few times, but my opinion is that it's a complicated interplay of the two, and that some things are more influenced by environment than genetics, and some things are more influenced by genetics than environment. And anyone that's telling you that they're 100% expert in what that ratio is, I would be wary of, because, well, it's like the definition of a dynamic. So I should have said this on the last slide, but the point I was making in that father like son metaphor I was using was the first part of Scar's idea there about how like who the parent is has an effect on the environment that the kid grows up in. So what Scar's talking about here is this idea of how this fit between the child and their environment. And again, this is like applying the nature nurture viewpoint to a child in a social setting now that they're growing up in, mainly the family, and that and starting to grow into the social community. And so now this is kind of the second part of this, is that there's also this what's called, and so think of what something being evoked means. It means being like drawn out, and that like who they are, that the genotype that the kid is, so like who they are, they perform a certain way, and that actually has an effect on how the environment responds to them. So the example up there that's kind of trying to simplify it a bit is like happy kids tend to get more of a happy reaction from other people, therefore tend to get more stimulation, more people want to play with them, more people want to be around them. That it's almost like how they're behaving is engaging an environment in a way that's a response to a certain degree, right? Where just like being, and it's obviously true for adults too, right? But we're talking about kind of child development right now, but it's not like us walking around and being negative about everything has no effect on our interactions. Of course it does. That there's this interesting dynamic correlation, and correlation is an important word because it means it's not one causing the other. It's that they're not causing each other, but they're definitely related, right? And the more kind of academic way of saying definitely related, although not causing each other, is correlated. Like they're, this is a kind of dumb example, but it being cold outside doesn't make you wear a coat, but it being cold outside and you wearing a coat are highly correlated. They don't cause each other, but the chances that they're happening at the same time and that there's a relationship between them is high. So now, theoretically, I want us to go even deeper on this and think about this idea that not only is there this heredity, so right, so on the last slide we were talking about almost like how the fact that the kid's happy and that them being happy makes them be more enjoyable for other kids to be around, and them being more enjoyable for other kids to be around leads to them being included more in games, and that leads to more positive stimulation, and that it's like kind of like how they're being at that personality level. And then the third kind of level of this is when Scar's talking about how what she calls active niche picking, genotype environment correlations. So say that fast a bunch of times. That's just a fancy way of saying that the kid picks out situations that make sense for their personality in a more active way than the last example. So if in the last example it's like, well, they're happy, it's not like they have necessarily tons of control over their tendency towards negative emotion. It's some kids are just different that way. Kids that are more positive emotionality are more likely to blah blah blah. So at that level we're talking about kind of this more genetic level predisposition, where at this level we're saying now add to that. So again, going more down this rabbit hole of complexity, it's like kids are also making decisions, and they're also seeking situations that they want, right? So like maybe they're not a completely passive in this process. So I have here like note the active role that the individual is playing in this situation, that they're active. There's this active choice. Again, a correlation. There's a correlation between kind of how people seem to be predispositioned and what their choices are. So that means that then people even become more molded to their situation. So now, again, I'm using human pictures here, and this is maybe a mistake because this is probably the most complex level to try to analyze it. It's like it makes almost more sense if we're talking about like a simple ocean creature, and we're talking about how do things get so specific? How do certain things develop in such highly specialized ways? Well, some of it is because of what they are is designed that way, and some of it is because they're also choosing to engage in certain ways. And so there's like these multiple things at play at once. And this is all involved in this word niche picking, right? And niche just means like kind of finding your role and how you fit in your world, what your niche is. That's a complicated idea. And it's really getting to the heart of a more complex and nuanced look at this kind of age-old philosophical discussion around nature-nurture. And then just to finish on this contribution by Scars, so this idea of niche picking, I always struggle with that word for some reason. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but the idea here is that the environment, so it kind of makes more sense in some ways if you're looking at like say birds. So look at these birds. It's like 3 species of birds live in the same tree, but they don't interfere with each other because they're not competing. They're doing different things. They're eating different things. They have different demands for their nest. They have their different role. It's like trying to play basketball and all 5 people on the team want to be the point guard. It's like that you would say there that the niche definition is very poor. Like people are all trying to play the same role. Niche picking refers to finding an environment that's suited to one's ability, right? Finding like the role that makes sense, or that not necessarily makes sense, but the role that is suited to one's ability. And that's often related to genotype, which is another way of saying that like there's underlying influences affecting what environments are more suited to our individual abilities. I know this is a kind of weird presentation because we're going from like pretty science, we're swinging pretty hard science and then pretty hard philosophy, but I think that's the thing is it's not like there's a full consensus on this. This is an interesting and kind of contested idea of where this line is between what is genetic and what is social or environmental or nurture or parenting or the role of school or the influence of media. Like all those things would be, even social media, all those things would be on the side of how nurture affects us. But that it's easy to ignore this whole ocean of our ancestral past that's also informing who we are, whether we're aware of it or not. And that's where people like Freud are so interesting, because I really think that he was talking about some of this stuff without the language, and that when he's talking so much about the instinctual influences on us, some of it is this stuff. Again, I should insert a little disclaimer. That's Mike's opinion, and let's keep going. So here's another topic that's super interesting: epigenetics. When we get to this, in your notes, you might want to just put that it's, well, I guess the definition's right there. It's pretty clear. But epigenetics is basically like how environment influences genes, the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than alteration of the code itself. That if, say, for example, an environmental pressure is not allowing a certain gene to be expressed, that not allowing it to be expressed has an effect and can actually have a modification causing effect, which is another way of saying the environment can affect the gene. It can go both ways. And that's where you can see the images on the side, that taking like a kind of hard hereditary environment correlation view of this idea of how your genetics influence who you are, and then you're kind of just that person in an environment. This is starting to say, well, okay, well, that's an oversimplification, that actually certain things, for example, exposure to certain toxins or whatever that might deny certain gene expression, actually the denial of that expression causes an altercation to the genetic code itself. Now, why does that matter? Well, because the genetic code itself is what would be passed on to the next generation. So this is where, the classic idea of like a kind of butterfly effect, heredity environment, and this is a kind of complex idea also, that our heredity, so what we've inherited, and our environment, you can't really understand it as additive. It's not like this plus this equals this. It's just way more complex than that. Way more, I keep using the same word, dynamic, but the word of dynamic is just like multi-layered connections that are mutually influencing. It's like, it's complex. I keep saying that same thing, but it's interesting to look at this idea that it's not like this plus this equals this, that genes may produce proteins during lifespan, and that in many environments, the way that genes are expressed affect our life trajectory, and that this has like really significant effects in terms of certain kinds of genetic disorders, right? Especially if things are interfering with our cells' normal ability to healthily create proteins and reproduce and all those kind of things. And that's where, we start to get into the realm of when we start to get into having genetic problems, especially ones that are associated with environmental things. So this is where that kind of stuff would be. And we'll get into that a lot more kind of in the course when we're talking about age-specific stuff. I think I'll touch on it a little bit still today, but that is something I'm definitely going to come back to. Conception occurs when a single sperm cell from a male unites with an ovum egg cell in a female's fallopian tube in a process that's called fertilization. Okay, sorry, I don't know why I read that so technically like that. But over the next few months, the genetic code discussed earlier that we've been talking about this whole time, this instruction manual we were saying, directs a series of changes in the fertilized egg. But many events and hazards can influence how this process develops. Okay, so that's kind of the point. And then the other idea, sorry, I missed this, is that you can also talk about pregnancy. We're going to talk about this prenatal development and conception, and sometimes people talk about these stages, and sometimes they talk about trimesters. And so a trimester is quite simply taking the 9 months of pregnancy, breaking it into three-month chunks in general. Trimester 3 time periods. That's what that means. right? And this is when we're really looking at when this human fertilized egg goes all the way to being a live baby. It's so, you might find this interesting, like, so I'm 39 now, and my daughter is 4, just turned 4, just started school this week too. I don't know if I've mentioned that, so it's went pretty good. If you're wondering, it's been pretty good. She was a little bit cryy today, which, you know, she's a big daddy's boy, so it was probably tougher on me. But even though my wife was the one that took her today, just thinking about it, I took her on last time, Tuesday, because they're not going every day right now in Kitchener. They're gonna start going every day next week, and she was pretty good, but she got all shy and stuff at the end. And anyways, it's I'm going through the dad emotion of my kid going to school for the first time. The reason I was saying all that, though, and kind of got lost on that tangent, is that I taught developmental psych for a long time. I've taught this, not this class, but at Conestoga College, I've taught in developmental psychology for probably 12 years now. And a lot of years I teach it 2 or 3 times because of how the semesters go there. Like I'll often, like this year, I already know I'm teaching it now in a different kind of version, and I'm gonna do it again in the winter. And I think, and I love it. I think it's like definitely my favorite subject to teach because I think it's so core to understanding so much of our experience and who we are and why we experience things the way we do and all kinds of stuff. But I think why I'm on this rant is to say that like it changed for me after I had my own daughter, right? And witnessing my wife going through the pregnancy process, and that it really is something that is so normal that it's easy to underestimate just like how incredibly dynamic it is. That during these trimesters of pregnancy, the genetically embedded pre-programmed code directs a series of changes in this fertilized egg. And that's actually what like pregnancy basically is. And we're going to just kind of look at this for a little bit here. So again, I was kind of mentioning this on the last slide, but this idea that you can break these trimesters of pregnancy sort of into these 3 what are called trimesters. So the germinal, the embryonic, and the fetal. And so that chart there sort of just shows like it's basically, and it says at the bottom there like it's approximate because obviously not every month has the same amount of days, so it just is kind of awkward. I remember when my wife was pregnant, and at first it's like, oh, it's like we're at week 6, and all of a sudden you're at like week 23. So what month is that? And you're like doing the math in your head, and it's like, if you're probably laughing if you maybe there's a few, I don't know if there's any moms in the class. I don't know you that well yet, but some of you may have kids yourself, and it's kind of interesting. It's one of the only times in life where we talk about things in terms of weeks. But anyways, that's a weird side rant that I should maybe edit out, but whatever. Okay, so the point here is it's just broken into those 3-month chunks. All right. Now, if we're looking at this completely from the perspective of kind of being fascinated by how the biology and how the biology is obviously informed by the evolutionary pressure and the evolutionary inheritance, and how this developmental process is happening at this very biological, physical, but also how that's like kind of the foundation for what we're going to call mental, because obviously like the physical development of the brain and the nervous system and all that, you can't really separate that from your psychology and your emotion and all that. So it's really the physical development of all of it. This germinal period, this conception to 4 weeks, we see this rapid cell division, just rapid, fast division by the zygote that begins that begins in the germinal period. Within 1 week after conception, we start to see a differentiation of the cells. So a differentiation just is a, you might know what that word means, but differentiation just is like a fancy way of saying they start to become different, right? So all the cells, which is absolutely mind-blowing, that they start from the same thing and then they start to multiply and separate. And then as they do that, they start to become different things, differentiate. They start to specialize for different tasks. And within a week after conception, that specialization has already started. At this stage, the organism is now called a blastocyst. It consists of a hollow ball of cells. But that hollow ball of cells eventually develops into the embryo. And that outer layer of cells later provides the nutrients and the support for the embryo. Implantation, the embedding of that blastocyst in the uterine wall, takes place during the 2nd week of conception. Sorry, my voice whistled weird there. So at this stage like that, we're only talking about 0.25 centimeters. But even at that size, there's a spinal cord, there's a nervous system, there's lungs, there's an entire gastrointestinal system, so like guts and intestines, and like basically can process food and go to the washroom, and a heart. So you'll notice brain's not on that list, but I guess it sort of is in terms of spinal cord and nervous system. At this stage, it's hard. They're obviously coming from the, it's not, your brain isn't your spinal cord or your nervous system, but your brain is just around the corner at this stage, and the building blocks of it are already there. So the argument of if it's there or not, it's somewhat a semantic of what specifically you're meaning. And at this stage, there's this surrounding amniotic sac that envelops the tissue of the entire body. So like you can see it in that picture quite graphically, is the kind of purplish sac. Okay. So now we're in the 2nd stage. Okay, so now we're in the embryonic stage. So this is the stage that, in general, of course, there's going to be some minor variations, but this is roughly the 16-week point. At this time, we're at a size of about 0.4 centimeters, weighing about 112 grams, so like incredibly small. But at this time already, there's a heartbeat. Already, skin is transparent. All right, so like the skin's already there, which is, skin's an outer organ. There's a downy hair, which is called, like, it's, I don't know, I don't want to use the word fur, but there's almost like a light hair covering the body. We start to see the emergence of some of these skin-related things. So like a skin-related thing would be, I know that's not a scientific way of saying it, but it's kind of under that broad category, things like fingernails and toenails. Okay. The embryonic period of prenatal development occurs from 2 to 8 weeks after conception. During the embryonic period, the rate of cell differentiation, so that idea I said before in the last slide of like cells like split up and then they start to become different, and that's like, we just say that and we just move on as if that's not incredibly almost like magic. Like how does something just become like a lung cell, and something else just becomes a heart cell, and something else just becomes a neurotissue, like a brain cell? It's like that point alone is like spellbindingly interesting, I think, anyways. So during this embryonic period, the rate of cell differentiation, so that amount of it then becoming different, intensifies, and that supports the development of things going from cells to organs. That the mass of cells is now what we call an embryo, and that there's 3 layers of cells that start to form. That the embryo's endoderm, which is spelled E-N-D-O-D-E-R-M, is an inner layer of cells which develops into the develops into the internal body parts of systems like the digestive system and the respiratory system. Okay, so yeah, basically our digestive system and our lungs. The ectoderm, so this is a different word than above, This is spelled Ectoderm, ectoderm. The ectoderm is the outermost layer, the surface, the sensory receptors. So that we're talking now ears, nose, eyes, and skin parts like hair and nails. So this is kind of very interesting, right? Like these are like layers. So there's like the endoderm, like the most internal part, the extoderm, which is the most external part. So that's like like literally it said there, like your ears, your nose, your eyes, your skin, your hair. And then there's this another layer here, a third part for your note. It's called a mesoderm. I know this is getting super biological in the language, but I think it's fascinating. So this is MESODERM, the mesoderm is the middle layer. So it's not the first thing, which was like the actual digestive system or whatever. It's not the second thing, which is like the ears, the eyes, the skin, like that outside of our body. It's the mesoderm is the middle layer, those parts that surround the internal areas. So the things around those internal things. So now we're talking about like bones, muscles, your excretory systems that control things like our biochemistry, our reproductive system. We call this, what I'm really talking about is the creation of what we call organs. And actually the creation of organs is a word that's called organgenesis. Oh, it's like organgenesis. So Genesis, obviously, like the same way as it's used in like the Bible to mean like the beginning. So the genesis of something's the beginning of Genesis. I mean, the beginning of the thing. So organgenesis would mean like the beginning of how organs, where they come from. And so the word is like almost just organgenesis, but there's an O in the middle. So it's organogenesis. But it's just one word, like ORGANOGENSIS. Sorry if it's annoying that I spell that. I'm just assuming some of you are taking notes and want to have the spelling right. While they're being formed, the organs are especially vulnerable to environmental influences. Right? So this is an important point that, and this is true of all organisms and also humans, that, for example, at certain times in the pregnancy, certain things are more dangerous to baby than at other times. And one of the risks of alcohol is that it slips through the placenta, and it's like the ethanol can affect the baby. So that's why I'll get to that in a sec. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. At the embryo's 3 layers form, right? So we talked about those 3 layers that I was talking about, like the inner layer, which is like, or actually like, well, I don't have to, you know what I'm talking about. I've been rambling about this forever. Those 3 layers is, as those develop, those are like with the life support system. That's like what we are. These systems include things like the umbilical cord, which develops from the fertilized egg. It actually doesn't come from the mother's body. In a way, it comes from the egg and the placenta. For example, the umbilical cord typically contains 2 arteries and 1 vein, and it connects the baby to the placenta. And the placenta, and I know you probably know some of this, but I'm just kind of giving the specific terms. The placenta consists of a disc-shaped group of tissue in which small blood vessels from the mother and the offspring intertwine but don't join. Like, again, it's like, it's common to know what that is. Like, people know that the placenta is the sac the baby's in. Like, it's like, but it's so interesting to think that it's like this in-between space. It's intertwined but not joined. Very small molecules, oxygen, water, salt, nutrients from the mother's blood, as well as carbon dioxide and things like digestive waste from the baby's blood, pass back and forth between mom and baby. Larger molecules, however, can't pass through that placental wall. So it's like a shield for the baby in a lot of ways. But this is also why the baby is uniquely sensitive to alcohol, and why alcohol can be uniquely dangerous to the baby, as ethanol has been experimentally shown to cross through that human placenta barrier. It's important to note that the mechanisms that govern that transfer of substances across that barrier are still not entirely understood. Right, so I'm ending all that by saying that's what we think, but it's important to know the specifics of that interaction between mom and baby in the womb is so complex that we're still learning more about it. I want to just add a point of clarification. I realize I might have been a bit confusing about this, that because I'm using the term trimester also, because I'm kind of using it in two ways. Sometimes, because trimester sort of just means 3 distinct periods, and so of time, it has a time specificness. So it's like 1, 2, 3. So it is like this here where we're talking about that these stages, like for example fetal and embryonic, but when you hear people sometimes say like first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, they're talking a little bit differently. And so let's read this. In addition to describing this prenatal development in terms of a germinal, embryonic, and fetal period, some people also discuss it in terms of trimesters in kind of more common discussion. And when they do that, they tend to break it on a more traditional, like 3-month, 3-month, 3-month. But when we're talking, and sorry, and I kind of wasn't clear about that's kind of like the one way people use that word. But when we're talking about these stages, it's still 3 stages, but it just doesn't, they're not equal amounts of time. The fetal stage is much longer than the other 2. All right, so sorry if I think I was unclear with that earlier. Okay, so at this fetal period, we're seeing the baby's now 36 to 43 centimeters, weighing almost like 1,400 grams, starting to add body fat. Starting to add body fat, starting to get physically active, right? So mom's feeling a lot more kicks. We're starting to actually see some rudimentary breathing. So that's interesting. It's like, what does rudimentary breathing mean? It's like we can't actually call it breathing, but you would have to call it something that comes before breathing. Sorry, I had a weird pace there with that sentence, but what I mean is like rudimentary means like the step before the thing. So it's like you're doing the behavior that is eventually going to be full breathing. So now, in addition to this development, I want to look at, in addition to those, like looking at it as trimesters and as those periods of development, I also want to talk about and kind of do this as a side piece because it's happening within the same chronological time period, but that it's kind of useful to also look at how within that process there's kind of these 4 phases of what we would call the development of the brain. And these 4 phases are, I think, super interesting. So the first of these phases is the development of what you see there in red, which is called the neural tube. Okay, so this is like the earliest thing that we would call the brain. By the time the baby's born, they've had approximately 100 billion neurons that are handling all kinds of information processing at a cellular level. As the human embryo develops inside the mother's womb, the nervous system begins forming as a long, hollow tube located on the embryo's back. This pear-shaped, like a pear? I don't know why I said that. Obviously, that's what that means. This pear-shaped neural tube, which forms at about 18 to 24 days after conception, develops out of the ectoderm that we talked about before, like ECTODERM. The tube closes at its top and bottom and at about 24 days after conception. So that tube finishes the development of the neural tube. So that's pretty cool, eh? So that's the picture of it. You can kind of see it if you look. It's kind of inside that red area. It almost looks like a, I don't know, it almost looks like a deer head or something. Like it looks like a triangle kind of at the top, and then you see it going down. And that tube is the pear-shaped tube, I guess. Let's go with pear-shaped tube. I don't know why I'm trying to find a different metaphor. So there's not many, especially from a genetic brain development perspective, there's not many more interesting topics than neurogenesis. So a little while ago, like within a few minutes ago, I was explaining the word genesis as meaning kind of the origin of the story of the origin, right? And the place you most likely have heard that term is in relation to the Bible, and like the Genesis is like the origin story for the Bible in that context, right? So in this context, it means like this idea that now we're in this stage where the brain cells are creating other brain cells and they're starting to interact, and we call this neurogenesis. And you can have in your notes here that neurogenesis is basically, it's like the production of new neurons. And a neuron is a very specific type of cell that is a brain cell. Right? So this is like the most evolved type of cell. This is neurogenesis. This is like the most complex part of our biology. Not, I don't know, that's a tough claim. I just freestyled that. There's a lot of complex things about our biology, but this is almost like this is the building of brain cells. Obviously, I'm kind of freestyling a bit here, but I just want to kind of say like this, look at that picture for a sec. It's like this is the creation of your brain. Another layer to this, so we're getting kind of close to the end, but another important layer of this is what's called neural migration. So remember that your neurons are your cells in your brain. Neural, it's kind of just the same word. So we're talking about here brain cells. We're talking about how brain cells move and migrate. This mass movement of neurons from the germinal zone where they're being created sort of to their ultimate destination. So it's so complex. It's like there's this generation it's like they're being, I don't want to use the word that they're being like manufactured in a factory and then spreading out, but it's like, that's at least metaphorically, there's some explaining value in looking at it like that. That the peak period for this is like the 3rd to 5th month of gestation, that we start to see that this straightened out, or we start to actually see movement, and this is what's kind of being graphed there. That approximately 6 to 24 weeks after conception, neural migration occurs. Cells begin moving outward from their point of origin to the appropriate location and creating different levels, structures, and regions of the brain. Once a cell's migrated to its target destination, it must mature and develop a more complex structure. At about the 23rd prenatal week, connections between neurons begin to form, a process that constitutes postnatally, continues postnatally. Sorry, I'll say that again. At about the 23rd prenatal week, connections between those brain neurons begin to form, and that process continues postnatally, which is just meaning like it starts then and it continues like even after the kid's born, and that's a process that is kind of core to how the brain is growing. And this neurogenesis is a topic that continues, right? So it's not just limited to prenatal development, but it's a huge part of it. But it continues beyond it. And, if there was, and a lot of these, you're kind of getting me in this presentation on some of the aspects of psychology I find most interesting. And I think if you're going to look at interesting ideas in psychology, it's not just how these brain cells are, the genesis of them. It's not just neurogenesis. It's not just where they come from. It's also how they then connect to each other. And that's actually kind of what we mean when we're talking about your brain and your mind, and like what's the difference between those. And it's like it's happening at that spark between points, those neurosynapses, right? That information jumping from one cell to the next. It's like that's your thinking, that's your emotion, that's your memory, that's your decision making, that's your pain, your joy. So neural connectivities, you could have that in your notes, is just the connection between brain cells, and that as the child, as we get closer to birth, and then even past birth, it gets more complex, more interconnected. I put there, for practical purposes and for understanding purposes, you can almost think of this as like a wiring diagram. If you were going to actually try to draw how the wiring of your brain looks, what you're trying to draw is your neural connectivity. So I don't know how much you're talking about stuff like this in your other courses related to child development. I'm sure you're touching on this stuff at some level. I'm just going to put these all up here for a sec. But it's like there's obviously a lot of hazards that can happen during a process as complex as what we've been talking about. And some of those processes can be coming from the environment. Oh, there's one more super important one. So stress. This idea that, and I think as we get into the course, we'll talk more specifically about certain things when we're talking in certain contexts. But when we're specifically talking about prenatal development, the risks of certain types of drugs, and I know there's a lot of different drugs, so talking in blanket statements about drugs is problematic, but in general, I'm talking here about substances, things like environmental pollutants, things like certain diseases that maybe mom has, certain things related to diet and nutrition, or in more usually malnutrition, if we're talking about things that are a problem. Maternal age is just a reference to how things get more complicated the older mom is past a certain point. And then the emotions and stresses. I'm going to be making this point of the relationship between cortisol levels in mom and in baby, and that there's the emotions mom is experiencing affect baby, and that shouldn't be overly surprising considering at this point there's still two inside of one. Like there's still physically, you couldn't be more, the fact that one's biochemistry is affecting the other would be expected, right? So I think it's really interesting. It's all these, and we could do a whole lecture on all of these, but these are what you would have to say as things that are potential threats to the complexity of the process we were talking about to this point. And again, I'm not trying to make any kind of moral judgments about anybody. It's like, I'm just saying, looking at this strictly biologically. So I'll address this part relatively quick. I'm sure a lot of you know this. This is kind of the completion of this process is the actual physical birth. And I don't think we should quickly fly past this part. I think it's one of the most complex things that happens to human beings. We literally make other human beings. I know you obviously know that, but it's philosophically such an interesting idea. And that, so this has these kind of stages of contraction, and when the cervix starts to dilate and actually start to change in size, the head starts to prepare to move through the cervix and enters into the birth canal, and after birth the emergence of the placenta. And that this is all things that we can just say as 3 quick points along the side of a slide, but it's like so incredible that the female body is able to do that. It really is quite a marvel of, well, in a course like this, we would talk about it as a marvel of, I guess, evolution. But again, people would, if you've grown up in a religious scenario, I think that the conversation between evolutionary psychology and religion hasn't happened at a super good level yet. And if you're interested in stuff like that, I would highly recommend going back and reading some stuff by William James, especially The Varieties of Religious Experience, which I think I've already mentioned in this course, but was written over 100 years ago, but is still probably one of the most interesting looks at how psychology meets spirituality. All right, that's a bit of a rant. I don't know why I got into that. But anyways, it's like, because obviously I think I was talking about how the miraculousness of it from like a biological and a nature perspective. And obviously people have throughout time viewed it as having spiritual and religious and those kind of connotations too, right? And so, I don't know, I was just trying to, I guess, acknowledge that. Okay, next slide. So once a baby's born, it's immediately assessed on this APGAR scale. So this is looking at, that's APGAR is just an acronym, which is basically looking at giving the child a score in terms of activity level, pulse. Is the child grimacing? Like basically, that's a good thing, right? Like they're responding to discomfort. That what their appearance is, skin color, like in terms of being blue or pale, and then their respiration, their breathing. So to determine like the health of the birth of the child, I meant to say, how healthy the birth was. So this chapter was a bit quicker than the other one, and I know saying that a 2-hour presentation is quick is an interesting choice of words, but I know that these lectures are supposed to be around 3 hours. So what I'm thinking is I am going to provide extra video content. I might actually do some kind of reaction style videos with some content related to today's presentation, because there's a lot of things that there's a lot of these things that we've been talking about that would be really interesting to view in the context of animations, right? Like it's hard to explain how cells divide and replicate and differentiate in like verbally, sometimes as easy as it is or as impactful as it is to show it through video. So I'm going to kind of play around with that in the next couple of days, but I want to get this out now. And so before I do that, though, I want to summarize some of the points from today. That this idea that evolution proposes that natural selection is what's fueling a lot of this, right? That natural selection, which just means that it's natural in the sense that it's just what happens in nature, right? See the word nature in the word natural. It's just the pressure of being alive in that moment, in that situation, and that pressure fuels adaptation to promote an organism to be more likely to survive in their specific habitat. What I'm trying to do with these chapter summaries is, I know in these chapters I kind of go all over the place, and what I want to kind of do at the end is just kind of hammer down on 10 to 15 core points that kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about. The second one, evolutionary psychology holds that adaptation, reproduction, and survival of the fittest are important factors in shaping behavior. That if we're going to understand a whole variety of things, and it says their behavior, but most of things related to our experience, because it's not like it doesn't have effects on things like emotions or thought patterns, but this idea that these three things have huge impact: how we've adapted, the role of reproduction, right? So sexual selection is a huge selection pressure. It's one of the main ones Darwin talked about. That evolutionary developmental psychology, so again, that's a big thing to say, but all it's saying is like developmental psych being looked at from an evolutionary perspective emphasizes that humans need an extended juvenile period to develop these large brains and to learn the complexity of our social communities, right? So this is the idea we were talking about of how having for humans, and this is also true for, I was saying, like some of the primates, and especially probably the closest thing to us with this would be like whales and dolphins, where the kids are kids for a longer amount of time, and that actually is linked to their time available to develop their brain cognitively. That except in the sperm and egg, the nucleus of each human cell contains 46 chromosomes, which are composed of DNA. So some of what we learned about today got pretty specific into the biology. That genes are actually short segments of DNA that collaboratively direct cells to reproduce and manufacture proteins. So think of that. There's a lot in that sentence, right? It's this idea of it being this coding, that genes are passed onto new cells when these chromosomes are duplicated during these processes we talked about of mitosis and meiosis. That genetic principles include those involving this idea of what are dominant or recessive genes, what are sex-linked genes, what's this idea of polygenetic inheritance. chromosome abnormalities. So when, again, like the kind of cold, harsh way of saying that is when there's these copying errors, and that how those are linked to things that we talk about as chromosomal conditions that people like, things like Fragile X and Down syndrome. And I know abnormalities is a dated word. It's what they say though in psychology sometimes to me. And when I went to, I gotta say, like when I went and was in university, I don't know if it still does. They probably have changed how they call it. They must have by now. But like there used to be programs in abnormal psychology, and that's where you would study everything. Basically, abnormal just means not normal, when things deviate from the average. When something, I don't want to say goes wrong because that implies that it's negative always, but when there's something that's I think I'll go with what I said there, a deviation from the normal. Just one follow-up point to that last slide, when I'm saying from normal, and I keep using the word normal, I want to also say that in psychology, the word normal is, or what is often, instead of saying normal, they'll say a norm of behavior. So like it's normal, the norm of when kids start to walk, or when they start to talk, or when people go through puberty. And what that means is if you took 100,000 people and you wrote down when everyone went through those things, and then you made an average of that, that average would be the norm. Right? So when I'm saying normal, I'm not saying like that what's normal is good and anything else than that's like somehow from a moral perspective worse. Okay, that was a long-winded way of saying that. In Scar's Heredity Environment Correlation View, right? So we talked about those 4 points from her, that heredity directs the type of environment children experience. Scar identified 3 types of these. Sorry, I said 4, but 3 types of these: the passive, the evocative, and the active. And then she kind of, the 4th thing was she kind of tied that all together with this idea of niche. Then we talked about what was called the epigenetic view, right? This idea that how the influence between genetics and environment is a two-way arrow. The epigenetic view emphasizes that development's a result of this ongoing bidirectional, meaning the two-way arrow, interchange between heredity and environment. It's the interest in developing regarding how gene interaction, right? It's interested in development in relation to how gene interaction influences and how things are transferred intergenerationally. So that last sentence, there's a little bit of a grammar error. Sorry about that. I think this is a tough one. We didn't touch on it too much, and we will in other chapters, but this idea of how we can see even at this age that the role of parental behavior has effects, and we're going to get more into especially when the effect is coming in the neighborhood of neglect. And I know it's a sensitive topic, and I'm going to address it very sensitively, especially once we start getting into next week and stuff. But it is something that needs to be said, is this idea of the negative effect this has. The younger the child, the more dire or the more severe the consequences often are. Again, I'm talking in general, which I know is sometimes a tough thing to do about super complex personal things. The interaction of heredity and environment is complex, but we can create a unique developmental path by changing our environment. Just because our environment's complex doesn't mean that we can't have a role in shaping it, and that shouldn't be a priority in developing a healthy life. And that, I'm kind of jumping all over a little bit, but even I'm talking kind of as adults there, but even at a young level, the child's way of engaging the environment has an effect. Prenatal development can be divided into 3 periods: the germinal, the embryonic, and the fetal. That the epigenetic studies look at how early bonding, if it's not always critical or possible, but that it's helpful in the development of competent infants, meaning like in the textbook a bit, it talked about scenarios where when mom's not responsive, and that's going to be something we're going to talk about more next week. And but because it's not really about prenatal development like this, but the reason that was something that was talked about in the textbook in this chapter was because they were talking about epigenetics in general, and it's an example of that. But like I said, we'll get into that a lot more once we're talking about especially kind of early childhood, and also next week with infancy. So you survived week number 2, biological beginnings. This was probably the most biology, kind of hard sciencey of the presentations, although that's not necessarily true, because there's going to be that's definitely going to be a core theme, the physical, cognitive, like the biology, psychology, and development, and how that is kind of mirrored or reflected in some of the things that we see in the social and psychological development of the emerging brain, child, person, human, emerging adult, right? And how looking at deeply into this idea of, now let's take some of these ideas and apply it to the life model. And next week we're going to start right at the start and get into infancy. Now that we've established how the baby got there, now we're going to look at how now this baby's born and introduced into this complex social world. Now that brain, now it's introduced to the social sphere. All right, I love doing this. I hope these are enjoyable. I think this is going to be coming in at 220 or 215 or something, or 210 or something like that. I can't see from here, but I hope that I hope you learned a few things. I hope it wasn't too rambly or anything. I tried to stay pretty tight to my script a bit, because I just wanted to be specific, because I knew that, for a topic like this, I just wanted to present the science as best as I could. And I hope you found that enjoyable, and I'll catch you soon. Thanks. Take care.